She came to the West with nothing but a broken promise and a piece of land she'd never seen. The man she crossed the country to marry had already chosen someone else. She was stranded, penniless, and completely alone, until a stranger on horseback asked her one simple question that changed the entire course of her life. "Stay with me. You won't regret it. Welcome. This is a place where the Old West comes alive through stories of love found in the wilderness, of cowboys with honest hearts, of mothers who sacrificed everything, and strangers who chose kindness when no one asked them to. If stories about courage, compassion, and the love that holds people together move you, you belong here." This story is a reminder that sometimes life has to fall completely apart before it can lead you exactly where you were always meant to be, and that the right person, arriving at the right moment, can turn your worst day into your greatest beginning. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.
Caleb scooped them both up and carried them inside. The girl felt like she weighed nothing, and the baby felt like even less. He laid them down on the rug by the old wood stove. His body went to work before his brain could even catch up, yanking blankets from the sofa, stuffing more wood into the fire, and reaching for the kettle. The girl's feet were a dark purplish black. She had no shoes, just a thin cotton dress, flimsy as a piece of paper, soaked through and frozen stiff. Who on God's green earth would let a child wander into a Montana blizzard wearing something like that? The baby hadn't made a single peep. With trembling fingers, Caleb unwrapped the frozen shawl. The little one was tiny, far too small for 7 or 8 months old. Her skin looked like old wax, and her lips were the color of cold ashes. He gently placed 2 fingers under her jaw and just waited. He felt a pulse. It was weak, and it was slow, but it was there. The little girl's head suddenly jerked up. She was awake, but just barely. Her eyes locked onto him from where she lay on the floor looking wild and full of fire. "She is alive, thank the Lord." The girl struggled to sit up, but just crumpled back down. "Thank the Lord. Thank the Lord. Now don't you move, you hear me? Just stay flat. Give me my sister. She needs to be warm. Skin on skin. You know about that? My mama taught me." The girl's teeth were chattering so hard that her words came out all jagged. "Put her on my chest, right under the blanket." For that first drink of warm broth was a shock. It made her choke and sent tears streaming down her cheeks. He told her, easy now, not too fast." She drank about half the cup before she pushed it back toward him. "Josie needs some," she whispered. He replied, "You drink first." But she shook her head. "She is just a baby. She has to go first." Caleb just stared at this little girl, giving orders from the floor where she lay half-frozen and barely awake, still putting her baby sister before herself. He found a clean cloth, dipped it into the warm broth, and showed her how to let it drip onto the baby's tiny lips. For 10 long minutes they saw nothing. Just drip, then wait, drip, then wait again. The baby's mouth just hung open, limp and useless. Ellie started breathing faster, panicked. "Come on, Josie," her voice was cracking now. "Please, come on, you have to drink." Drip, wait. Then the baby's little tongue moved. "There," Caleb said, leaning in closer. "She is swallowing. Do you see that?" "I see it." Ellie was crying for real now. "I see it. She is drinking." "Just keep at it," he said. "Slow and steady does it." After that, they worked without a word. Drip. A small swallow. Drip. Another swallow. Josie's eyelids began to flutter. Her tiny fists uncurled. A little noise came from her throat, thin and weak. It was not a real cry, but it was not silence either. Ellie just slumped against the floor and started to sob. There was no sound, just her whole body shaking as tears ran down the sides of her face and into her hair. She cried like someone who had learned the hard way that making noise only brings punishment, not comfort. Caleb just let her cry. He fed more wood to the stove, warmed up more broth, and found a pair of thick wool socks in the old trunk by the door. Ruth's socks. He had not touched that trunk in 2 whole years. His hand just paused over the lid for what felt like a lifetime before he finally pulled it open. The smell was the first thing that hit him. It was lavender. Ruth always put little bags of lavender in with her wool clothes. That scent cut right through 2 years of the careful numbness he had built around himself. For just a second, he was right back in their bedroom, watching her fold the laundry, humming some tune with her hair falling across her face. He snatched the socks and slammed the trunk shut. "Here," he said, kneeling down beside Ellie. "These should help your feet." "Whose are they?" she asked. "It does not matter. Just put them on." Ellie managed to sit up just enough to pull the big socks over her ruined feet. She winced when she did it, but she did not make a single sound. Caleb could see the blisters, some broken and bleeding, and the skin between her toes was cracked and raw. 40 miles walking barefoot through the snow. "Why did your aunt not give you any shoes?" he asked. He fought to keep his voice steady. "She told me I did not deserve the ones she had bought for me. Said I had been ungrateful." Ellie pulled the socks up as gently as she could. "She said ungrateful children have to walk barefoot. She said it is in the Bible somewhere." "Well, it is not in any Bible I have ever read." "I do not think Aunt Harriet reads the Bible much," Ellie said. "She just likes to use it when she wants to hit you with something that sounds holy." Caleb almost let out a laugh. He would have, if things had not been so terribly ugly. "Are you hungry?" "Yes, sir, but Josie needs to eat first. Josie is drinking her broth. She is doing just fine. Now, it is your turn." He walked over to the pantry and came back with a loaf of bread and some dried deer meat. He set it all down right in front of her. "Eat slow now," he warned. "Your stomach has been empty for too long. If you eat too fast, you will just make yourself sick." Ellie ate with a kind of controlled panic, like someone who had learned to eat quickly before her food could be taken away. Even though she was trying to go slow, she finished that bread in just a few minutes. Caleb just brought her some more, without saying a word. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" he asked. "The day before yesterday," she answered. "Aunt Harriet gave me one piece of bread when she told us to leave. It was frozen solid by that night." One piece of bread for a 40-mile journey. And a jar of water that froze solid, too. Caleb's hands balled into fists under the table. "What else did she give you?" "A piece of paper," Ellie said. "It had the name of a mission in Douglas on it. She said they take in orphans. She told us to just walk north. Douglas is 60 miles from Laramie. I know that now. I did not know it then. I have never been very good with distances." Ellie wiped the crumbs from her mouth. "I got turned around when the storm hit. I thought I was going north, but I must have gone west instead. The snow makes everything look the same." "Did you knock on any doors?" "Every house I passed. 4 farms, I think. Maybe 5. Her voice turned flat and empty. "At the first one, nobody came to the door. At the second one, a man looked at us through the window and then just pulled the curtain closed. At the third, a woman opened the door, saw Josie, and said, 'I cannot get involved,' before shutting it in my face." "Which farms were they?" "I do not know their names. One of them had a big red barn about 10 miles south of here." "The Hendersons." Caleb filed that name away in his mind. "After that third door, I stopped knocking for a good while. I just kept walking. Josie, she stopped crying around noon today." Ellie's hand reached out and touched her sister through the thick blanket. "That is when I got really scared. My mama always said that a quiet baby is a sick baby." "Your mama sounds like she was a smart woman." "She was smart about most things, but not about Aunt Harriet, I guess." Ellie adjusted the blanket around Josie. "Mama made me promise her right before she passed away. She said to take care of my sister. She said Harriet would help us out. She said, family always helps family. What happened to your mother? She died right after Josie was born. She lost too much blood. The midwife said she could not stop it. Ellie said it just like you would say the sky is blue. It was a fact so big and so real that all the feeling had been worn away from it. She got to hold Josie one time, said her name, and then she was just gone. And your father? He died 6 months before that. There was a cave-in at the silver mine. Ellie looked him straight in the eye. So then it was just me and Josie and Aunt Harriet. And Aunt Harriet, she made it real clear, real fast, that we were a problem she did not want. What do you mean by that? I mean I cooked every meal. I cleaned every single room. I washed every piece of clothes, and I took care of Josie day and night. And she still called me lazy. She still said I was not earning my keep. She still said we were eating her out of house and home. Ellie's jaw got tight. I was only 10 years old. Josie was a brand new baby. We did not eat all that much. Caleb poured more broth into her cup. His hands were perfectly steady, but deep down inside his chest, something had started to shake. So why did she really make you leave? What is the real reason? Ellie did not say anything for a minute. Josie stirred against her chest, making little warm, sleepy sounds. Mr. Piton, Ellie finally said, her voice low. George Piton. He owns the general store down in Laramie. He started coming over for supper on Sundays. Aunt Harriet would put on her nice dress and make me cook something special for him. She would act all sweet and smiley, like a completely different person. Ellie pulled the blanket up a little higher around Josie, but she told me I had to keep Josie quiet whenever he was visiting. She said a crying baby would scare him away. She said no man wants a woman who comes with baggage. So I would have to take Josie outside, even if it was freezing, and walk her around the yard until she fell asleep. Then I would just sit in the barn until Mr. Piton finally left. How long would you be out there? Hours, sometimes. One night Josie had a bad fever. She was screaming and screaming, and I could not get her to stop. Mr. Piton was inside, and I could see he was getting annoyed. Aunt Harriet came to the back door, and she told me to take Josie to the barn and not to come back until he was gone. Caleb's coffee cup made a cracking sound in his hand. How cold was it that night? It was cold enough that I could see my own breath in the barn. I wrapped Josie up in every horse blanket I could find, and I just held her all night long. Her fever broke by morning, but Aunt Harriet was furious. She said I had embarrassed her. She said Mr. Piton told her he would never marry a woman who was saddled with someone else's orphans. Ellie looked right at Caleb. 2 days after that, she gave me that piece of bread and told me to start walking. All because of a man. Because of a man who did not want children around. Caleb set his cup down on the table very carefully. If he squeezed it any tighter, it would have turned to dust. She put 2 little children out in the middle of a blizzard just to keep some man happy. She said we were ruining her last chance at a life, Ellie continued. She said she had already given us more than we ever deserved, and she said if I ever came back, she would have the sheriff arrest me for trespassing. Ellie's voice was steady. She had already cried all her tears out on that long 40-mile walk. She said nobody would ever miss us. The fire crackled in the stove. The wind howled and threw itself against the windows. Out in the barn, one of the horses stomped its foot. She was wrong about that, Caleb said, his voice quiet but firm. Ellie just looked at him. You do not even know us. I do not need to. I know what I pulled out of that snowstorm tonight. I found a girl who walked 40 miles through a killer blizzard to save her baby sister. A girl who gave her last bit of water to that baby before she took a drink herself. A girl who knocked on every door she could find and got turned away every time, and she still kept going. He met her gaze. I do not need to know your name to know you are worth something, Ellie Morgan. Any fool with eyes could see that. Ellie's chin started to tremble. She bit down on her lip hard. We will not be any trouble. Stop saying that. But we will not. I promise. I can cook, and I can clean. And I will take care of Josie all by myself. You will not even know we are here. I want to know you are here. The words just came out before Caleb could stop them. They took him by surprise. He cleared his throat. There is a room upstairs. It is the second door on your left. The bed is clean. Whose room is it? That was my wife's sewing room. Your wife? She passed on 2 years ago. Ellie watched him for a long, quiet moment. You have that same look, she said, her voice barely a whisper. What look is that? The one my mama had before the end. It is like you are standing right here, but your mind is a million miles away, like a piece of you wandered off and never found its way back. A lump formed in Caleb's throat. He got to his feet and turned away, making himself busy at the stove. He knew if he kept looking at this girl who saw clean through him, something he had spent 2 years holding together would surely shatter. Go on and get some rest, he said. Both of you. We will figure things out come morning. Ellie pulled Josie close to her chest and got up on legs that trembled. She made it to the staircase, gripping the railing, and then she paused. Caleb? Yes, thank you for stepping outside. The wolves were right at the fence. I had to. No, I mean... She hesitated. Every other door I knocked on, someone peeked out and decided we were not worth their time. You came out with a rifle into the dark in the middle of a blizzard. You had no idea what was waiting out there. You just came. I suppose I did. Why? He considered the question. He thought about hearing that scratching sound on the gate. He remembered how his first thought was to just let it be, pour another whiskey, and let the storm take care of it. He recalled how he stood there at the door for 5 whole seconds, his hand on the latch, battling the urge to stay locked away in his own quiet world. I do not know, he said, telling the plain truth. Maybe I just got tired of being the kind of fellow who keeps his door shut. Ellie gave a small nod, as if that was all the explanation she needed. Then she started up the stairs, slow and steady, with the baby held tight to her heart, and vanished into Ruth's sewing room. Caleb was left standing alone in his kitchen. The fire crackled, the blizzard howled outside, and the house that had felt empty for 2 years now held the sound of 3 beating hearts instead of just 1. He sat down at the table and stared at the photograph of Ruth on the mantel. Her smile, her hand resting on her belly 3 months before the diphtheria took her. I do not know what I'm doing here, Ruth, he whispered to the picture. But I opened the door. I finally opened the blame door. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, a noise from upstairs woke him from a dead sleep. It was Josie crying, but not the faint whimper from before. This was a real, powerful cry, full of anger, the sound of a baby who had been to the brink and was mad as hornets about the journey. Caleb grabbed the edge of the table as something inside his chest gave way. It was not sorrow this time. It was something else, something he could not yet name. He warmed some milk, took it upstairs, and placed it just outside the sewing room door with a clean cloth for feeding. He knocked one time very gently, and then backed away before Ellie could see him lingering there. 15 minutes later, the crying faded. He could hear the soft sounds of drinking, followed by silence. And then, so quiet he almost thought he imagined it, a young girl's voice started humming a lullaby that drifted down through the floor. It was a tune he had never heard, likely something her own mother had sung to her. A song passed down from a grandmother who came over from Ireland with just a needle and a prayer to her name. Caleb sat there at his late wife's kitchen table, listening as a stranger's child sang life back into the silent rooms of his house. The storm would pass by morning. Morning would bring questions that needed answers. Morning would bring the outside world with its rules and its family claims and its cold way of deciding who belonged where. But for tonight, the door was open, and for the first time in 2 years, Caleb Weston had no desire to close it. The girls slept for 16 hours straight. Caleb went to check on them 3 times. He looked in at dawn, again around noon, and one last time when the storm finally gave up and the sun sliced through the clouds like a knife. Every time, Ellie was curled around Josie on top of the covers, not beneath them. Her arms were wrapped tightly around the baby, even while she slept. It was like she was still standing guard. Like her body did not know how to stop protecting her, not even for a minute. The third time he checked, he left a glass of water and a piece of bread on the bedside table. When he returned from the barn an hour later, they were both gone. The bed was made so perfectly you could have bounced a quarter off it. Every single surface in that sewing room had been dusted and wiped down. Ruth's piles of fabric scraps, which had sat on the cutting table for 2 years, were now folded in perfect squares and sorted by color. He found Ellie down in the kitchen. She had already swept the entire floor, scrubbed the countertop, and washed every last dish in the basin. She was standing at the stove with Josie tucked in a makeshift sling from an old tablecloth, stirring a pot of something that smelled better than anything that had come out of his kitchen in a long, long time. "Morning," she said, not even looking at him. "I found some oats and dried apples. There was some cinnamon way in the back of the cabinet. I hope you do not mind. You do not need to be cooking. I told you I would work for my keep." She shot a look at him over her shoulder, and her eyes were pure steel. "I am a girl of my word." Caleb went over to the stove and peered into the pot. The oatmeal was creamy and perfect, just the way Ruth used to make it on mornings when the world felt too cold to face without a warm meal inside you. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My mama," she said. "She always said cooking was the one skill no one could ever steal from you. She told me you can lose your home, your fortune, your good name, but if you know how to feed folks, you will always have value." Ellie shifted Josie in the sling. "I made every meal at Aunt Harriet's. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. She said if I expected to eat her food, I had best learn how to prepare it. You were only 10 years old. I was 9 when I started. I turned 10 that June." Ellie took 2 bowls out of the cabinet, as if she had been doing it in this house her whole life. "Should I take my bowl in the other room?" "Why in the world would you do that?" Aunt Harriet said children should eat separately. She said it was impolite for a child to sit at the table with grown-ups. Caleb pulled out a chair from the table and sat himself down. "This is your table now, too. Sit down." Ellie placed the bowls on the table, spooned out the oatmeal, and slipped into the chair opposite him. Josie made happy little noises from her chest, her tiny hands reaching for the spoon. For a time, they ate without a word. The oatmeal was the finest thing Caleb had eaten in 2 years, maybe even longer. "This is mighty good," he said. Ellie's shoulders relaxed just a fraction of an inch. It was the first time he had seen any of the tightness leave her since she had first appeared at his door. "Thank you, Ellie." "Yes, sir. You can quit calling me sir." "I am not your boss." "What am I supposed to call you?" "Caleb will do just fine." She tried the name out silently, her lips forming the word, and then she nodded as if she had settled something important in her mind. When breakfast was over, she started to gather the dishes. Caleb reached out and stopped her. "Leave them be, but they need to be washed." "Need to." "They will wait. Sit back down." A look of fear flashed in her eyes. It was there and gone in an instant. She sat. "I need to get a good look at your feet," Caleb said, "in the daylight. They're fine." "No, they are not fine. You walked 40 miles through the snow with no shoes." "Let me see." Ellie paused for a moment, then carefully removed the wool socks. Caleb knelt down, and what he saw turned his stomach. There were blisters on top of other blisters, some broken open, others swollen and full. The skin between her toes was cracked and raw. 2 of the toenails on her left foot were completely black. Frostbite had set in on her heels, making the skin look hard and pale like wax. "Does this hurt?" he asked, pressing lightly near her arch. "Some." "Ellie, you have got a bad case of frostbite. You have to see a doctor." "No doctor." The words tumbled out of her. "Doctors cost money. We will not be a bother." "Stop saying that," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. She shrank back, and he immediately softened his tone. "A doctor is not a bother. A doctor is a necessity. There is a good one in town. Her name is Dr. Abigail Foster, the only female doctor in the whole territory." Ruth swore by her. "That is good enough for me." Ellie looked up at him with those old, weary eyes. "You're going to pay money for us?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because your feet are torn all to pieces and that baby needs to be properly examined. And because I can," he said as he stood up. "The storm is over. The road should be clear enough by this afternoon. We will head out first thing tomorrow. I can work today. The barn needs to be mucked out. I saw the latch on your chicken coop is busted. And the pantry looks like it could use a good sorting. And, Ellie," he paused until she met his gaze, "you do not have to work to deserve tomorrow. Tomorrow is already yours." She just stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. Then she got up, collected the bowls, and started washing them anyway because that was the only way she knew how to communicate. Work hard. Prove you are useful. Make yourself too valuable to get rid of. Caleb let her be. Some things you just could not fix with words. Some things just needed time. He passed the morning out in the barn while Ellie found things to clean that were already clean. He could hear her moving around inside the house, the sounds of scrubbing and sweeping and putting things in order. Josie's cheerful gurgling was a constant backdrop, and it made the old barn feel different. Not warmer, not really, but certainly less empty. Tom Garrett, the ranch hand who helped out 3 times a week, rode up around noon. He pulled up short when he saw the little set of footprints in the fresh snow leading from the house to the chicken coop. "You got visitors?" Tom asked, leaning his frame against the barn door. "Something like that." Caleb gave him the short version of the story. Tom's face showed about 6 different emotions before it finally settled on a grim look. "Laramie to here in a blizzard with no shoes." "That is right. With a baby." "That is right." Tom spit a stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. "Who is this aunt?" "Harriet Crane. Do not know the name, but I know the kind of person." Tom watched as Ellie walked from the house to the coop with Josie balanced on her hip, moving with a purpose you would expect from someone twice her age. That little girl works like the devil himself is nipping at her heels. She works like she thinks I'm going to kick her out the second she stops. "Are you?" Caleb gave him a hard look. "What kind of a question is that? The kind other folks are going to be asking." Tom held his gaze. A single man, no wife, no children of his own, taking in 2 little girls. You know what that looks like to a half-frozen child out of the snow last night. Folks can think what they please. I am not saying you did the wrong thing. I am saying you need to be careful. You best get the law on your side before the law comes knocking all on its own. Tom pushed himself off the doorframe. This territory has strong opinions about who ought to raise whose children. Blood kin talks a whole lot louder than good intentions. Caleb knew Tom was right. He hated it, but Tom was right. The very next morning, they all rode into town. Ellie sat stiff as a board on the wagon bench. Little Josie was bundled up in 3 blankets to fight off the chill. The girl had not said a word since they left the ranch, her eyes just scanning the road ahead like she was expecting trouble to jump out from behind every line of trees. "Are you doing all right?" Caleb asked her. "People stare at me. Nobody is staring at you. We are on an empty road. They will in town. They always stare. Aunt Harriet used to say it was because I looked like a charity case." "Well, you just look like a kid who needs a new pair of boots. That is exactly what we are getting after we see the doctor. You do not have to buy me any boots. I know I do not have to. I want to." Ellie went quiet then. Caleb could almost see her turning that over in her mind, trying to make it fit into the world she knew. The one where everything had a price tag, and nothing was ever just given freely. Dr. Abigail Foster's office was situated right above the general store on Main Street. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and hands as steady as a rock, who had fought tooth and nail for her medical license in a territory that did not think women had any business being doctors. Ruth had absolutely loved her, said she was the only doctor in all of Montana who actually took the time to listen. Dr. Foster took one look at Ellie's feet, and her face went as still and cold as a winter pond. How long ago did this happen? 4 days ago, Caleb said. 4 days without any treatment. Dr. Foster's voice was perfectly level. The kind of level that told you a storm was brewing right underneath. Bring her in here. I need to examine both of them properly." The whole examination took a full hour. Ellie sat as still as a stone while Dr. Foster cleaned her wounds, applied a salve, and wrapped her feet in clean, proper bandages. Josie screamed through her entire checkup with the healthy rage of a baby who did not appreciate being poked and prodded one bit. "The older girl is malnourished," Dr. Foster told Caleb out in the hallway while Ellie was getting dressed. "Not dangerously so, but it is enough to tell me she has not been eating right for months on end. She is small for being 11. Her muscle development is lagging, and those feet of hers, the frostbite on her heels will heal up, but 2 of those toenails are gone for good. They will fall off. And the baby, she was dehydrated when you found her, but she is recovering well. She is underweight by about 2 pounds for her age. Nothing that some proper feeding will not fix right up." Dr. Foster crossed her arms over her chest. "Now, do you want to tell me just how an 11-year-old girl and a tiny infant wound up walking 40 miles through the middle of a blizzard?" Caleb told her the whole story. He told her about Harriet Crane, Mr. Peyton, the bread and the jar of frozen water, and that little scrap of paper with the mission's name written on it. Dr. Foster's jaw got tighter with every detail. When he was done, she stood there quiet for a long moment. "I am going to write up a medical report," she finally said, "documenting every last thing. The malnourishment, the frostbite, the dehydration. You are going to need it." "Need it for what?" "For when the aunt comes looking for them." Dr. Foster looked him straight in the eye. "And believe me, she will come looking. A woman like that does not just throw children away and then forget about them. She throws them away and then gets mad as a wet hen when somebody else has the decency to pick them up. Why in the world would she care? She did not want them. She did not want the responsibility, but she will want the control. There is a big difference." Dr. Foster uncrossed her arms. "You need to get a lawyer, Mr. Weston, and you need to get one soon." They left the doctor's office and made their way across the street to the general store. Caleb bought Ellie a pair of boots, wool ones lined with soft sheepskin, the warmest pair the store had in stock. He bought her socks and a heavy coat and a wool dress that was plain but looked like it would last. He bought milk for little Josie and supplies for the ranch, and a bar of chocolate that he slipped into the bag when Ellie was not looking. At the counter, Martha Perkins, the shopkeeper's wife, watched them with a wide-open curiosity. "Are these some new additions to the Weston household?" she asked with a smile that was half friendly and half fishing for gossip. "Just guests," Caleb said, cutting it short. "Awfully young to be guests." Martha's eyes stayed on Ellie for a moment too long. "A pretty little thing. Is she yours?" "She is hers." Caleb nodded his head toward Ellie, who was standing by the window holding Josie, watching the street with the sharp alertness of a deer at the edge of a clearing. "She belongs to herself." On the ride back home, Ellie sat with the box holding the new boots on her lap, running her little fingers over the leather like it was the most precious thing in the whole world. "Nobody ever bought me shoes before," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Aunt Harriet just gave me her old ones. They were 3 sizes too big for me. I had to stuff them with newspaper just to keep them on. Well, these ones are all yours, brand new and just the right size. What happens if I outgrow them? Then I reckon we will just have to buy you new ones." Just like that. Just like that. Ellie opened the box, carefully pulled out one of the boots, and held it up against her cheek. The leather was smooth and still warm from sitting near the stove inside the store. She closed her eyes, and a look crossed her face that made Caleb have to turn away, because it was too raw, too open. It was the face of a child who had been given something for the very first time without being told exactly what it was going to cost her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You are welcome," Caleb said. "Yeah. How long is temporary?" He had been waiting for her to ask that question and dreading it just the same. "I do not know yet. Are you going to send us to that mission?" "No." "To another family, then?" "No." "Then what?" "I am working on it." He flicked the reins, keeping his eyes fixed on the road. "Dr. Foster said I should get a lawyer to figure out the legal side of this whole thing." The legal side means what? It means that if I want y'all to stay, I need the law to agree with me. And if the law does not agree, well, then I reckon I will just have to make it agree. Ellie was quiet for the good long while after that. Josie started to fuss, and she rocked her back and forth without even thinking. The motion was so practiced, it was just a part of her now. "Aunt Harriet is our blood kin," Ellie said at last. "The law sets a lot of store by blood. The law also ought to care about a woman who puts 2 children out in the middle of a blizzard, does it? Because nobody ever came looking for us. No sheriff, no one from the church, nobody at all. She put us out, and the whole world just kept on turning like we were never even there." Caleb did not have an answer for that one. She was right. The world had just kept on going. Doors had stayed shut tight. People had looked out through their windows and then just turned away. The whole system that was supposed to protect children like Ellie and Josie had failed them at every single turn. "That all changes now," he said. "How?" "Because now, somebody is finally paying attention." When they got back home, Caleb found something waiting for them at the gate. It was a basket covered with a cloth sitting right there in the snow. He picked it up and pulled back the cloth. Inside was fresh bread, a jar of preserves, and a note written in a careful hand. "I heard you had some company. Figured you could use a few provisions. Come and see me when you're ready. I've got a milk goat and more opinions than a dog has fleas." It was signed, Agnes Whitfield. "Who is Agnes Whitfield?" Ellie asked, peeking at the note over his arm. "My nearest neighbor, 5 miles to the west. She has been trying to feed me ever since Ruth passed away. I just kept turning her down." "Why?" "Because accepting food from folks means you are letting them in, and I was not letting anybody in." Ellie looked up at him with an understanding that no 11-year-old girl should possess. "But you let us in?" "Yeah." Caleb carried the basket inside. "I guess I did." That evening they ate Agnes's fresh bread with the preserves and the last of the venison. Josie sat in a makeshift high chair that Ellie had engineered, a crate turned upside down on a regular chair with blankets stuffed all around it, and banged a wooden spoon on the table with all the happy fury a baby can muster. "She is getting louder," Caleb remarked. "She is getting stronger." Ellie smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind a cloud, changing her whole face. For just a second, she looked like what she was supposed to be. A child, just a child, safe and fed and warm in a house. She has always been loud when she is happy. Aunt Harriet hated it. Well, I do not hate it. I know. Ellie tore off a piece of bread for herself. That is how I know this is different. After they finished dinner, Caleb sat out on the porch, even with the cold biting at the air. The sky had cleared up to a deep, dark black scattered with a million stars. His breath plumed out in white clouds in front of him. Inside, he could hear Ellie washing the dishes, humming a little tune to Josie. He thought about what Tom had said, about how all of this looked, about bloodkin talking louder than good intentions. He thought about Dr. Foster's warning. She will come looking. He thought about Ruth, about what she would do, what she would say to him. She would say, "Stop all your pondering and get to doing, you stubborn old fool." She would say, "Those children need you and you need them," and all the rest of it is just details. He went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and pulled out some paper and ink. He wrote out 2 letters. One was to Henry Blackwood, the lawyer there in town who had handled Ruth's estate. The other was to his son, Daniel, who was working at the copper mine up in Butte. The letter to the lawyer was all business. Guardianship petitions, legal protection, whatever it would take to keep those girls safe. The letter to Daniel was a whole lot harder. He just stared at the blank page for a good 10 minutes before any words would come. "Daniel, I know you are still angry with me. I know you have got every reason to be. But something has happened, and I need to tell you about it, even if you do not want to hear a word from me. There are 2 children in this house tonight, 2 little girls who lost everything and then walked through a living hell to get here. I opened the door for them. Your mother would have opened it a whole lot sooner. I am not asking you for forgiveness. I'm just asking you to know that this old house is not so quiet and empty anymore. That maybe there is still something here that is worth coming back to. Your father. He sealed both letters up and left them on the table for the morning post. Ellie appeared in the doorway just then. Josie was sound asleep against her shoulder, full of milk and peaceful. She is out, Ellie whispered. I fed her 3 times today. She is making up for all that lost time. Good, that is real good. Caleb looked at this young girl standing in his doorway, his late wife's sewing room now waiting upstairs, his late wife's socks on her feet, his late wife's kitchen finally warm again with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of life. Were true, though. The house had been too quiet for too long. He missed the noise of life. He missed having a reason to get up in the morning. He cleared his throat. Upstairs, second door on the left. It was my wife's sewing room. It is warm in there. You and Josie can have it. Ellie hesitated for a moment. We cannot take your wife's room. My wife has been gone for 2 years now, he said, his voice flat. It is just a room. Now go on. He watched her climb the stairs, a small, tough ghost carrying a precious bundle of life. He stayed by the fire for a long time, just listening to the house settle around him. It was not a silent house anymore. From upstairs, he could hear the faint, soft sound of a baby breathing. Then, around 3 in the morning, a real cry started up. It was not a weak little whimper, but a hungry, demanding yell, and Caleb smiled. He went into the kitchen and warmed up some more broth. When he took it upstairs, Ellie was already awake, rocking Josie in her arms. He handed the cup to her. Sounds like she is feeling a whole lot better. She is hungry, Ellie said, her voice filled with pure wonder. They fed the baby together. Afterward, Caleb went back downstairs, but he did not go back to sleep. He just sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and watched the sun rise over the endless snow. He knew exactly what he had to do. The next morning, he told her, Ellie. Yes? Tomorrow, I am going to town to see a lawyer. I am going to start the process of making all this official. Official how? Meaning you all stay here for real. Not just for a little while, for good. Ellie's face went completely still. Her arms tightened around Josie. What if Aunt Harriet tries to fight it? Then let her fight. She will, Ellie warned. She is mean, and she is stubborn, and she will say awful things about you and about me. I have heard awful things before, Caleb said. I was at Antietam. There is not much a woman from Laramie can say that is worse than the sound of cannon fire. The corner of Ellie's mouth twitched. It was not quite a smile, but it was close. Are you really going to do this? I already decided. When? When I heard Josie cry at 3 o'clock this morning. Caleb's voice grew rough. It was the strongest sound I've heard in this house in 2 years. It made me remember what it feels like when there is something in this house worth fighting for. Ellie's eyes started to shine. She blinked once, then twice, fighting back the tears. We will not let you down. I know you will not. And we will not be any... Ellie, he cut her off. If you say the word trouble one more time, I am going to make you eat your own boots. And she laughed. It was a real laugh, short and a little startled, like it had not been used in a long time. But it was real. Josie stirred at the sound, and Ellie gently pressed her lips to the baby's forehead to quiet her down. Good night, Caleb. Good night, Ellie. She turned and started up the stairs. He listened to her footsteps cross the landing, and he heard the sewing room door softly click shut. The door clicked shut, leaving him all alone in the kitchen. The letters sat on the table while the fire in the old stove was turning to embers, and a feeling settled over him that the very ground beneath his feet had just moved. It was not a tremor, more like a long-awaited thaw. It was the slow, almost scary, but certain breaking of the ice that had kept his heart frozen solid for 2 whole years. He glanced at Ruth's picture one last time. I reckon you would like her, he said, his voice low. "I think you would like them both." The photograph smiled right back, same as it always did, never changing. But tonight, for the very first time, looking at it did not make him want a drink. It made him want to wake up with the sun and get breakfast on the table before Ellie could get to the stove first. He banked the fire for the night, double-checked the locks, and headed up the stairs to his room. As he went by the sewing room, he could hear Ellie's voice, soft as a moth's wing, talking to Josie in the dark. "We are safe, Josie. We are truly safe." He opened the door, and he is not going to close it again. I just know it. I can feel it. Caleb stood there in the hall and laid his hand flat against the wall. Then he went to his bed and slept clear through the night for the first time in 2 years. 3 weeks changed every last thing, and yet nothing at all. The ranch just woke up. That was the only way Caleb knew how to put it. Rooms that had been shut tight were opened up. Windows that had been boarded against the world let in the light. The kitchen smelled like fresh biscuits and strong coffee every single morning because Ellie was up and at it before dawn. No matter how many times he told her to sleep in, she had taken over the chicken coop completely. The birds had not been laying much for months, just moping around, cranky from Caleb's half-hearted care. But within a week of Ellie talking to them, giving them table scraps and letting Josie toddle around the coop to give the hens something to stare at, their egg production doubled. "You got a special way with animals?" Caleb asked her one morning, as he watched her gently persuade an egg out from under the most stubborn hen on the place. "Mama always said animals can tell when somebody cares. They can feel it." Ellie carefully placed the egg in her basket. These chickens were just lonely. That is all. Lonely chickens. Everything gets lonely, Caleb. Even chickens. He sure could not argue with the proof in that basket. Agnes Whitfield drove up on the 4th day, steering her wagon through the mud with the kind of grit you only see in a woman who has stared down 40 Texas winters and was not about to let the 41st get the best of her. She brought fresh milk from her goat, a thick wool blanket she had knitted herself, and enough strong opinions to fill the county courthouse. "So, this is the girl." Agnes stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, sizing up Ellie with her sharp blue eyes. "You are a bit smaller than I pictured." "Yes, ma'am." Ellie stood up tall, holding Josie on her hip, with her chin held high, ready for whatever judgment was coming. Agnes walked right over to her, looked down at Josie, and her tough, weathered face went soft. "A pretty baby. Is she eating good?" 3 square meals a day now. She is getting stronger." "Good. Goat's milk is the best thing for little ones who have been poorly. I will bring a jar by every week." Agnes then turned her gaze on Caleb. "You look better." "Better than what?" "Better than the walking ghost you have been for 2 years. She said it plain as day, the way only old friends can get away with telling you the hard truths. Ruth would be happy. Do not start, Agnes. I am not starting anything. I am just stating a fact." She pulled a chair out from the table and sat herself down without an invitation. "Now, you tell me about this aunt." Caleb told her the whole story. Agnes listened to every word, not once interrupting, her expression getting stormier with every detail he shared. When he was done, she sat quiet for a long moment. "Harriet Crane," Agnes said, drawing the name out. "I have heard that name before. She does some sewing for a few of the ranchers' wives over near Laramie. Sweet as pie when she wants something from you, but cold as a snake when she does not. You know her?" "I know of her, and I know George Piton. He is just a weasel in a waistcoat, owns the biggest mercantile in Laramie and thinks it makes him some kind of king." Agnes looked straight at Ellie. "She threw you out on account of him, yes, ma'am. And now she will come sniffing around wanting you back because losing you makes her look bad in front of folks." Ellie just blinked. "How did you know that?" "Because I have been alive for 60 years, child, and I have seen every kind of cruel there is in this world. The kind that throws you out, and the kind that comes back to pick up what they threw away." Agnes stood up and smoothed down her skirt. "Caleb, have you called that lawyer yet?" "The letter went out yesterday." "Good. You make sure he is a fighter." You are going to need a fighter when that woman shows her face. She gave Ellie's shoulder a gentle pat as she walked by. You are safe here, girl. This man is too stubborn to let a single thing happen to you. And if he starts to waver, I am just 5 miles down the road with a shotgun and zero patience for fools. Ellie managed a small smile. Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. Agnes. Mrs. Whitfield was my mother-in-law, and bless her heart, she was a terror. After Agnes had gone, Ellie stood by the window watching the wagon shrink into the distance down the long road. She is nice, she said softly. A little scary, but nice. That is Agnes for you. She was Ruth's best friend, the only one who kept coming around after Ruth passed. I turned her away every time. She just kept on coming anyway. Why did you turn her away? Because I wanted to be left alone. Do you still? Caleb looked at her. At this girl standing right in his own kitchen with a blanket from his dead wife's friend over her shoulders and his dead wife's old socks on her bandaged feet, holding a baby on her hip who giggled at chickens. No, he said, I do not. Henry Blackwood's answer arrived the next Tuesday. It was a short letter, written in a neat hand asking for a meeting at his office in town. Caleb rode in by himself, having left Ellie and Josie with Agnes, who had offered to stay out at the ranch for the afternoon. Blackwood's office was situated above the bank, a small room crowded with law books that smelled of pipe tobacco. The lawyer was a tall man, likely in his late 50s, with silver hair and the slow, careful way of speaking of a man who weighs every single word before he uses it. He had served in the Confederate Army and came out west to get away from the ruins of everything he had once believed in. Ruth had put her trust in him. For Caleb, that was all that mattered. Have a seat, Blackwood said. Tell me everything. Caleb talked for a solid 30 minutes. Blackwood just listened, making a few notes here and there, his face not giving a thing away. When Caleb had finished, the lawyer put his pen down. You want guardianship? I want them to be safe. That is not the same thing in the eyes of the law. Blackwood leaned back in his chair. Guardianship means the court officially makes you responsible for these children. It means the aunt's legal claim is either ended or put on hold. It means a judge has to look at all the facts and decide that a widowed rancher with no blood relation is a better choice than a blood relative. She nearly killed them. Prove it. The doctor looked them over. Malnourished, frostbitten, dehydrated. Good. Medical records make for powerful evidence. What else do you have? Ellie's testimony. She can tell the judge exactly what went on. She is 11. The court might see her testimony as unreliable, or they might claim you coached her. Blackwood tapped his pen on the desk. What about witnesses? Did anybody see the aunt put them out? Not that I know of. Did anyone see the children on the road? Anyone they asked for help? Ellie knocked on 4 or 5 doors. Nobody answered except for one woman who slammed the door right in her face. Do you know who? A farm with a red barn about 10 miles south of here. The Hendersons. Mary Henderson. Blackwood wrote down the name. She could be a very helpful witness if she is willing to testify that she turned away 2 children during an ice storm. It shows the community failed these girls. It makes what you did look even more necessary. I do not want to win by using other people's guilt. This is not about what you want. This is about strategy. Blackwood looked at him with a steady gaze. Mr. Weston, I'm going to be frank with you. The law favors blood ties. It always has. A widowed man with no family of his own taking in 2 young girls. Some people are going to question your reasons. Let them question. They will. And you can bet the aunt's lawyer will make sure the judge questions them too. Blackwood stood up and walked over to the window. I knew Ruth. She was a good woman, the very best. If she were still alive, there would not be any question about this. A married couple taking in orphans, well, that is just Christian charity. A single man doing it, that is suspicious. Suspicious of what? You know what of. Caleb felt a hot anger rise in his face. That is a dadgum lie before it is even spoken. I know that, and you know that. But the aunt will use it. Blackwood turned back from the window. So, this is what we are going to do. We build a case so solid that no judge can rule against us without looking like a complete fool. We get medical records, character witnesses, proof of how much the children have improved in your care, and we need time. The longer those girls are thriving with you, the harder it will be for anyone to argue for taking them away. How much time? 3 months at the very least before we file. 6 would be even better. We want a clear and undeniable record of steady care. What happens if the aunt shows up before then? She will, Caleb. You can bet your last dollar on that. When she does, you keep a level head. You do not make threats. You do not stop her from seeing the children, but you sure don't hand them over either. Let her be the one to make the mistakes. A woman like Harriet Crane can't help herself. You just give her a long enough rope, and she will do the hanging all on her own. Caleb hated how cold and logical it all sounded. He hated thinking of Ellie and Josie as pawns in some legal chess match. But he knew it was necessary. What about that mission in Douglas, the one Harriet said she sent them to? That is a good thought. I will write them a letter. If they have no record of expecting these children, it proves Harriet sent them off without any real plan. That is negligence if we are lucky, and abandonment if we are not. Blackwood walked him to the door. One last thing. You mentioned a son, Daniel. He is grown, but get him home if you can. A family, even one that is not perfect, looks a whole lot better than a man on his own. A judge sees a father and son together. He sees stability. He sees a future. Daniel is not talking to me. Then you make him talk to you. Write him again. You keep writing until he answers you, or you run plumb out of ink. Caleb rode home with the lawyer's words tumbling around in his head. Build your case. Write everything down. Give her the rope. Get Daniel home. When he got back to the house, he found Agnes on the porch looking worried. What happened? Caleb swung down from his horse. Nothing bad, but the little girl had one of her spells. Agnes kept her voice down low. I found her in the kitchen about an hour ago, scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees. Her hands were raw and she was crying, just would not stop. She said she missed a spot under the table, and if you came home and saw it was dirty, you would send them away. A knot tightened in Caleb's chest. Where is she now? Upstairs. I finally got her calmed down. I fed her a little bit of soup. She is sleeping now. And little Josie is in the basket right beside her, happy as a clam. That baby has no idea what is going on, and thank the good Lord for that. Agnes gathered her belongings and put a hand on Caleb's arm as she walked by. That child has hurts you cannot see, Caleb. Her feet are going to heal. The rest of it is going to take a whole lot longer. After Agnes was gone, Caleb went up the stairs. The door to the sewing room was open just a little. He pushed it open softly. Ellie was curled up on the bed and Josie was sleeping right next to her. Her hands were red and cracked. The skin right over her knuckles was split open. He pulled a chair up next to the bed and just sat there. He waited. Ellie's eyes fluttered open. After a minute or two, she saw him and tried to sit up right away. I am sorry. I do not know what happened. You do not have to apologize for a thing. There was a stain on the floor and I could not get it out. I just kept scrubbing and then I could not stop. And I thought if you saw it, you would think I was not useful anymore. And, Ellie, stop. She stopped talking. Her breath was coming in ragged little gasps. Look at your hands. He said it real gentle. Look what you did to yourself. She looked down. The skin was raw, bleeding in a few spots. She just stared at her hands like they belonged to somebody else. Aunt Harriet used to check the floors, she whispered. She would run her finger along the bottom of the walls. If she found any dust, she would make me clean the whole house all over again. One time she found a spot under the stove, and she did not let me have any dinner that night. You are not at Aunt Harriet's house anymore. I know that. I know it up here. She touched her head. But I do not know it down here. She put her hand flat over her heart. My body does not know it yet. My hands just start moving and I cannot make them stop. Caleb reached out and took her chapped hands in his own. Then I will stop them for you. I will do it every single time, until your body catches up with your head. What if it never does? It will. It just needs some time. How much time? As much time as you need. Ellie's face started to crumple. I do not want to be broken. You are not broken. You are hurt. There is a big difference. Big. What is the difference? Broken means something cannot be fixed. Hurt means it is in the process of healing. And you are healing, Ellie. Every single day, even when it does not feel like you are. She squeezed his hands and gave a little nod. Josie stirred beside her, making tiny noises in her sleep. For a while, they just sat there in the quiet, with the late afternoon sun coming through Ruth's window and little dust specks dancing in the golden light. Caleb. Yeah. What did the lawyer say? He said we have a fight coming, but it is a fight we can win. Winnable means we might not win. Winnable means we will win if we do everything just right. And doing it right means what? It means building a case, going out and finding witnesses, showing the court that you are better off right here. I am better off here, I know that. Now we just have to prove it to some judge. Ellie was quiet for a second. Will I have to see her again? In court? Probably so. Will I have to talk? Tell them everything she did? If you are willing to. I am willing. Her voice got hard all of a sudden. I will tell them everything. About the cooking and the cleaning and that cold barn, and Josie's fever, and the bread and all that walking, all of it. Are you sure? It is not going to be easy. Nothing has been easy since Mama died. Ellie sat up a little straighter. But this is worth fighting for. You are worth fighting for. Something moved inside Caleb's chest, something he did not have a name for. He cleared his throat and stood up. I am going to make supper tonight. You are going to go sit on that porch and do absolutely nothing. I do not know how to do nothing. Well, it is about time you learned. She let out a laugh, a small one, like she did not want to, but it was real. The next 2 weeks settled into a kind of rhythm that felt almost like peace. Ellie went to see Dr. Foster 2 more times, and her feet got better and better. The frostbite healed up, the dead toenails fell off, and brand new ones started to grow in underneath. Foster wrote down every single detail with the careful attention of a man building up his ammunition. Caleb wrote to Daniel again, a shorter letter this time. No pleading, just the facts. The older girl's name is Ellie. She is 11. She cooked me breakfast her first morning here, and it was better than anything I have made in 2 years. She talks to the chickens, and I swear they listen to her. She scrubs the floors until her hands bleed because she is scared to death I will kick her out if she misses a single spot. The baby's name is Josie. She laughs at just about everything. She took her first steps yesterday, 3 of them before she tumbled over, and she did not even cry. Just pushed herself back up and tried it again. Your mother would have loved them, Daniel. She would have loved every single minute of this. I wish you were here to see it. No answer ever came back. Caleb sent the letter off anyway and just waited. Then on a Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd week of January, Caleb heard the sound of hoofbeats coming up the south road. He was out in the barn fixing a piece of harness when the sound carried to him. It was fast, determined, the kind of ride-in that meant somebody was coming for a reason. His stomach sank. He put down the harness and walked to the barn door. A buckboard wagon came up over the hill. 2 horses pushing hard through the snow. A woman holding the reins, dressed all in black even with the cold. A skinny, nervous-looking man sat beside her, his hands clamped tight on the side of the seat. Caleb knew who it was before the wagon even reached his gate. He walked toward the house. Ellie was in the kitchen, and Josie was in her high chair. Both of them were covered in flour from trying to make biscuits. She looked up when she heard his boots and saw the look on his face. All the color drained right out of hers. She is here, Ellie whispered. Is not she? Get Josie. Go on upstairs. No, Ellie, no. Ellie wiped the flour from her hands, picked up Josie, and stood up straight. He would not hide. Not this time. Especially not from her. Caleb looked down at this little girl, just 11 years old, with a flower-shaped scar on her cheek, and a baby balanced on her hip. She stood right there in his kitchen, her jaw tight, and her eyes blazing with more grit than he had seen in most grown men. "All right," he said softly. "Then you get behind me." He walked out onto the porch, and Ellie was right there with him. Josie was snuggled up tight against her chest. The wagon rolled up to the gate and came to a stop. The woman climbed down with quick, sharp movements. She was a tall, thin woman, her face all angles, carved out by bitterness and too many cold winters. Her gaze swept over the whole place, the house, the porch, and then it landed on Ellie like a hawk finding its rabbit. Her voice sliced right through the chilly air. "Mr. Weston, I am Harriet Crane. I do believe you have my nieces." Caleb moved to the edge of the porch steps. "I know who you are. Then you know I have come for what belongs to me. They are not yours. They are not a piece of property." Harriet's lips pressed into a thin, hard line. "They are my blood, my own sister's children. The law says they belong with their family. The law also says you do not leave children out in a blizzard to freeze to death. I did no such thing." Harriet's voice was clipped, like she had practiced the words. "I gave them supplies and told them how to get to a charity mission. The older girl was always headstrong. She must have gotten herself lost." Behind him, Caleb heard Ellie make a tiny, angry sound. "You gave her half a loaf of bread and a jar of water that was frozen solid in 3 hours," Caleb said, his voice steady and low. "No shoes and no coat in December. That baby was just hours from dying when they found their way here. Children have a habit of stretching the truth." "The doctor did not stretch the truth. I have the medical papers. Frostbite, starvation, dehydration. It is all written down." For just a second, something flickered in Harriet's eyes. It was the first crack in her story. The skinny man climbed down from the other side of the wagon. He shuffled his feet back and forth, looking mighty uncomfortable. "Harriet, maybe we should—" "Be quiet, George." George Peaton, the man behind it all. Caleb looked at him and felt nothing but pure disgust. This was a man who would let 2 little children be tossed out into a deadly storm because they were in the way of his courting. "You brought your sweetheart along," Caleb said. "That is a bold move." Harriet lifted her chin high. "Mr. Peaton is my fiancé. We will be married in the spring. We will give the girls a proper home, a real family." "You were not much of a family when you threw them out into the cold." "I made a mistake, born from being desperate. I am here now to make it right." "You are here because it looks bad," Caleb crossed his arms over his chest. "A woman throws out her dead sister's children, and then the whole territory gets word of it. That is not the kind of name a general store owner's wife wants to have." Harriet's face turned a deep, blotchy red. "How dare you?" "I dare because I was the one who pulled those girls out of the snow. I dare because that baby's heart was barely even beating. I dare because Ellie's feet were so cut up and frozen that she could not walk for a whole week." "Ellie." Harriet's eyes locked onto the girl standing behind him. Her voice changed, turning all sweet and syrupy, but with poison underneath. "Ellie, darling, you come here. Let me have a look at you." Ellie did not budge. "Ellie, I know you are mad at me. I surely understand that, but things are going to be different now. George and we are going to have a real home, a proper one. You and the baby will have your own room. You will not have to work so hard anymore. It will all be better, I give you my word." Ellie's voice came out steady and cold as ice. "You promised Mama you would take care of us. You promised her as she was lying there dying." For just a moment, Harriet's calm expression broke. "I tried, Ellie. I truly did my best. Your best was to send us out to die. That is not what happened." "Yes, it is." Ellie finally stepped out from behind Caleb. Josie held on tight to her big sister, her eyes wide with fear. "You gave me bread and water and told me to just walk north. You did not give me any shoes. You did not give me a coat. You said if I ever came back, you would have the law arrest me. And then you just shut the door in my face. You are twisting my words." "You always twist things all around. I am telling the truth. It is the same truth I am going to tell the judge." That word, judge, hit Harriet like a hard slap across the face. Her eyes snapped right back to Caleb. "You are taking this matter to a court." "I have already filed the papers." "On what grounds?" "Abandonment, neglect, putting children in danger. You can take your pick." Harriet's hands balled up into tight fists at her sides. Piton put a hand on her arm, but she just shook him off. "He will never win. You are a complete stranger, a single man with no wife, no family, and no good name. The court is going to see right through your act." "Maybe so, but they are also going to see right through you. And I have got the doctor's records, good folks to speak for my character, and the story of an 11-year-old girl who walked 40 miles through a blizzard because her own aunt chose a man over 2 little children." The silence that came after was so sharp you could feel it. Piton finally spoke up, his voice all thin and shaky. "Harriet, perhaps we ought to go through the proper legal ways. This is not getting us anywhere." "I told you to be quiet, George." "Mrs. Crane," Caleb said, and his voice was low and hard and final. "You can leave my property now. You can come back with a court order and the sheriff, and we will settle this according to the law. But you are not taking these children away from here today. This is not over." "No, it is not. But the next part of this story will happen in a courtroom, not here on my front porch." Harriet just stared at him, then at Ellie, then at little Josie, who had buried her face deep into Ellie's neck. Something passed over Harriet's face, too quick to quite make out. It might have been regret. Or maybe it was just the anger of a woman who had lost control of a game she thought she had already won. "You will be sorry for this," Harriet said. "Those girls are nothing but a heap of trouble. The older one has a sharp tongue, and that baby will drain every penny you have. You will see." "I have seen all I need to see," Caleb said, "and I do not regret a single thing." Harriet spun around on her heel, climbed back up into the wagon, and snapped the reins so hard the horses jumped forward. Piton had to scramble up beside her as the wagon wheeled around and headed back the way it came. Caleb stood there and watched until they were just a speck over the ridge. Then he turned around. Ellie was still on the porch, holding Josie in her arms. She was shaking from head to toe, but her eyes were dry and her chin was held high, and she had not moved one single inch. "She is going to fight mean," Ellie said. "I know she is. She is going to say awful things about you, about why you would want us to be here. She will make it sound—" "I know what she will make it sound like. Are you scared?" "Yeah." He did not see any reason to lie to her. "But I was scared at Antietam, too. And I got through that just fine." "What is Antietam?" "It was a battle, a real bad one. It was the worst day of my life, right up until the day Ruth died." Ellie reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were small and cold and still trembling, but her grip was like iron. "We are going to win," she said. "I do not know how just yet, but we are going to win. We have to. Because Josie deserves a good home, and you deserve to have a family, and I am not ever going back to her. I am not. I would rather walk another 40 miles in the snow." "You are not walking anywhere," Caleb squeezed her hand. "Not ever again, ever." They stood there on the porch together as the last bit of winter sun disappeared behind the mountains. Josie reached up and grabbed a hold of Caleb's collar, pulled herself closer to him, and laid her head right against his chest. She did it with the pure trust of a child who had decided this was exactly where she belonged. Caleb held perfectly still. He let her weight settle in. He let it fill up that hollow space that had been empty for 2 long years. Behind them, the house was waiting, warm and full of light and life. And somewhere down that road, a woman dressed in black was already figuring out her next attack. Harriet did not waste any time. The sheriff showed up on a Thursday, 8 days after she had stood at Caleb's gate and made all her threats. Caleb was out behind the barn splitting wood when he heard the sound of the hoofbeats. It was a single rider coming at a steady pace, not in a hurry, but with a clear purpose. He set the axe down and walked around to the front of the house. Sheriff Jack Tierney was sitting on his horse at the fence line, his badge catching the little bit of winter sun that managed to break through the clouds. He was a big man with tired-looking eyes and a reputation for doing the right thing, even when the right thing was messy. "Caleb." "Jack, I wish this was a social visit, but I have a feeling it is not." "No." Tierney swung down from his horse, tied the reins, and leaned up against the fence. "I got a formal complaint filed by Harriet Crane. She says you are keeping her nieces here against their will. Says you have denied her access to them and even threatened her." "The threatening part is a flat-out lie. The rest of it is close enough to the truth, all depending on how you choose to see it." "And how do you see it?" "I see it like this. 2 little children walked 40 miles through a deadly storm because that woman put them out. I see it like that baby was almost dead when I found them. And I see it like I have got the doctor's records to prove she neglected them, and a lawyer who is filing for me to be their guardian." Tierney took off his hat and rubbed his forehead. "I know all of that. I heard the whole story from Agnes Woodfield. I heard it from Doc Foster. To tell the truth, I have heard it from about half the town. Word gets around. Then you know I did not steal those children. They came to me for help." "I know. And just between you and me, I think Harriet Crane has all the warmth of a frozen tombstone. But I have got a job to do, Caleb. She has gone and filed a formal complaint. I cannot just ignore it. So what exactly are you telling me?" "I am telling you she wants me to do a welfare check. She wants me to confirm that the children are here and that they are being taken care of properly. And she wants to see them." "No, that is not a request. Then you make it an order. You get a piece of paper from a court that says I have to hand them over, and I will do it. Until then, they are staying right here." Tierney watched him for a long, quiet moment. "You know, I could arrest you for getting in my way. You could try. I do not want to try. I want to get this sorted out without anybody ending up in shackles." Tierney put his hat back on. "Here's what I can do. I can tell Harriet that I performed a welfare check and I found the children healthy and well looked after. That will buy you some time." "But Caleb, she is going to take this to the court. She has hired a lawyer out of Cheyenne, a fella named Cornelius Webb. He is expensive. He is sharp, the kind of lawyer who wins cases that ought to be lost. I have got Henry Blackwood. Blackwood is a good man, but Webb is a snake. And snakes win a whole lot more than they ought to." Tierney swung up onto his horse. "You get your house in order. When this thing goes in front of a judge, every little thing is going to matter. How those girls look, how they talk, how you look standing there next to them, everything. How much time do I have? The court date is set for March 15th. 6 weeks." Caleb felt the whole world shift right under his feet. 6 weeks. 6 weeks to build a case that would keep 2 little girls safe. 6 weeks. Harriet Crane walks into that courtroom and tries to take back the children she threw away. "Jack." The sheriff turned in his saddle. "Those girls, if you had just seen them that night. The little one was not even making a sound anymore. Ellie's feet were just raw meat. They were dying right there on my porch. I believe you. Then help me." The sheriff was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will make sure my report to the court shows what I have seen here today. Healthy children, a clean home, and proper care. That is the most I can do and still stay within the law. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. This is going to get a whole lot uglier before it gets better." He turned his horse and rode off. Caleb stood at the fence and watched him go. Then he turned and looked toward the house. Ellie was standing at the window. She had seen the whole thing. He went inside. 6 weeks, Ellie said, before he even had a chance to speak. "You heard?" "I heard enough." March 15th. That is the day we go before the judge, and Harriet has hired an expensive lawyer. We have got Blackwood. He is smart. Smart enough? We are fixin' to find out. Caleb sat down in the chair across from her. Ellie, I need you to do something for me. Something that is going to be hard. What is it? I need you to write down everything that happened at your aunt's house. Everything you can remember. The cooking, the cleaning, that cold barn, Josie's fever, and the night she put you both out. All of it. Every single detail. Ellie's face went pale, but her jaw was set firm. I can do that. It might hurt to remember all that. It hurts more to forget. Because forgetting means it did not matter, and it was important. Caleb gave a slow nod. You understand you will have to say all this out loud in a courtroom, with a judge and strangers looking on. With her looking on. I know. Are you certain you can go through with it? Ellie glanced down at Josie, who was on the floor working on chewing a wooden spoon like it was her life's mission. I walked 40 miles to make sure that little girl stayed alive. Talking in a room full of people does not seem harder than that. The next 6 weeks felt like the longest of Caleb's entire life. He poured himself into building their case with that same stubborn drive he had once used to build the ranch. He rode into town 3 times a week to sit down with Blackwood. They picked apart every detail, planned for every argument, and got ready for any trick Webb might pull. Blackwood was a thorough man. He sent a letter to the mission down in Douglas and got back a written confirmation that no children by that name were ever expected or registered there. The director of the mission even added a personal note calling the whole affair unconscionable. He rounded up folks to speak for Caleb's character like Agnes Whitfield, Tom Garrett, and Dr. Foster. Even the pastor from the Methodist Church who had known Ruth vouched for Caleb's solid moral standing. We are going to need more, Blackwood told him during their 4th meeting. The medical proof is solid as a rock. Your character witnesses are good people. But that aunt has a blood claim and a lawyer with a slick tongue. We need something to convince the court this is not just an act of charity. We have to show that these children have a real future with you. What kind of something? Family. When a judge sees a single man, he sees a risk. When he sees a family, he sees a foundation. I do not have any family. I have got a son who will not even speak to me. Then you had better make him speak to you. Caleb wrote to Daniel for a 3rd time. He did not beg or plead. He just laid out the plain truth. Daniel, the court date is set for March 15th. I am in a fight for 2 children who need a good home. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I am asking you to come stand in that courtroom and show a judge that this house can be a home for a family again. If you ever held any love for your mother, then do this for everything she believed in. She believed that helping other people was the entire reason we are put on this earth. I still believe that too. 2 weeks before the court was set to meet, a letter came. Caleb's hands trembled a little as he tore it open. It said, I am coming. Not for you, but for them and for Ma. I will be there on March 14th. Daniel. Caleb read the words twice, folded the paper with care, and tucked it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart. Ellie found him out on the porch that evening, just staring off into the distance. Is that good news or bad news? She asked. Daniel is coming home. Your son? Yes, the one who holds you responsible for his mother's death. That is the one. Ellie came and sat down next to him. Josie was inside with Agnes, who had started spending most afternoons out at the ranch. Are you scared? I am terrified. Of the court or of seeing him? Of both. What if he is still so full of anger? He will be. Anger does not just vanish in 6 weeks. No, Ellie said softly. It surely does not. But sometimes angry people still show up, and just showing up is what counts. Daniel rode in the day before the court hearing. He came in from the north on a horse that looked just as tired as he did. 3 years had changed him, made him harder and thinner. The boy he used to be was all burned away by the mine work and the bitterness from whatever demons he had been wrestling with. Still, Caleb met him down at the gate. They stood there on opposite sides of the fence, a father and his son, with 3 long years of silence and blame stretching between them. You came, Caleb said. I said I would. I know that, but saying a thing and doing it are not always the same. No, they are not. Daniel looked past his father toward the house. They are inside in the kitchen. Ellie is cooking. She always starts cooking when she gets nervous. Is she nervous? She is 11 years old, and tomorrow she has to get up in front of a judge and tell him about the worst things that ever happened to her. Yes, I would say she is nervous. Daniel swung down from his horse and tied the reins. They walked up to the house without saying a word. Caleb opened the door and a smell washed over both of them. It was the smell of bread, coffee, and something sweet with cinnamon. It was the smell of a house that was being lived in, a house that was loved. Ellie was standing at the stove, and Josie was in her high chair. Ellie had flour on her apron and a look of pure steel in her eyes. She looked right at Daniel, and he looked back at her. For a long moment, not a soul spoke. "You must be Daniel," Ellie finally said. "And you must be Ellie." "Yes, sir." "Do not call me sir. I work for my living." The corner of Daniel's mouth twitched just a bit. "My father tells me you make better oatmeal than he does. A fence post could make better oatmeal than he does." Daniel let out a short, surprised laugh. It was a real laugh. Caleb watched his son's face change, and he felt a knot that had been twisted tight in his chest for 3 years finally come undone. They all ate supper together. It was a bit stiff and quiet to begin with, but Josie took care of that like babies always do. She grabbed hold of Daniel's nose when he leaned in and just would not let go. The sound of Daniel's laughter filled up the whole kitchen. Ellie couldn't help but smile, and Caleb, sitting at the head of the table, just thought, this is what Ruth would have wanted. This is all she ever talked about. A full table, a warm house, and folks who lean on each other. After they ate, Daniel pitched in with the dishes. He and Ellie stood there side by side at the wash basin, and Caleb could hear his son asking her about the long walk, about the bad storm, and about Harriet. Ellie answered every question with the plain truth, no extra drama or feeling sorry for herself, just the facts. When she was done, Daniel was quiet for a good long while. Then he said, "You are a whole lot tougher than I am." "I do not believe that. I left home because I was mad. You left because you had no other choice. There is a big difference." Daniel wiped his hands on a towel. "I will go to court tomorrow. I will say whatever you need me to. Just tell what is true." "The truth about what exactly?" "About what you find here. About if this place feels like a real home." Daniel took a slow look around the kitchen, at the flour on the counter, the baby in her high chair, and the picture of Ruth on the mantelpiece, smiling down on them all. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "It sure does." That night, Caleb just could not get to sleep. He found Ellie out on the porch, wrapped up tight in a quilt and just staring up at the stars. "Cannot sleep either?" he asked. "Too scared," she said, pulling the quilt even tighter around her. "What if the judge rules in her favor? Then we will file an appeal. And what if we lose the appeal? Then we will file another one. What if we try everything and it all fails? Then I will come up with something else. I'm not about to give up. You promise?" "I promise." Ellie was silent for a minute. "Caleb, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "I used to say my prayers every single night back at Aunt Harriet's house. I would pray that God would send someone to come help us, someone who actually cared. And nobody ever showed up. Night after night went by, and nobody came. I started to think that maybe God was not even listening, or that nobody was. That maybe Josie and I just were not important enough for anyone to bother with. Ellie, but then I showed up at your door." Her voice started to crack. "And you came right out into a blizzard holding a rifle, and you picked us up and brought us inside. And you did not ask for a single thing in return. You just helped." She wiped at her eyes with her sleeve. So maybe God was listening after all. Maybe it just took him a little time to lead me to the right doorstep. Caleb wrapped his arm around her shoulders and drew her in close. This little girl had lost everything she had in the world, and somehow she still held on to her belief. This child had walked right through a fire and came out on the other side. Her faith a little bruised up, but not busted. "Maybe so," he said softly. "Maybe so." The morning came on sharp and cold. They all put on their best clothes. Caleb wore the same suit he had worn to Ruth's funeral. Ellie was in a blue dress that Agnes had stitched up just for this day. Josie was dressed in a tiny little outfit that Dr. Foster had dropped by. Daniel had on a clean shirt, and it looked like he had run a comb through his hair for the first time in years. The wagon ride into town was real quiet. Ellie sat squished between Caleb and Daniel on the bench, with Josie settled in her lap, her face looking pale but determined. She had braided her hair so tight it must have hurt. She looked just like what she was, a little girl trying her best to be brave in a world that had given her plenty of reasons not to be. The courthouse was packed full of people. News had gotten around. Small towns like this thrive on a good spectacle, and a widowed rancher fighting a blood relative over two orphan girls was the kind of story that would drag folks out, even in the cold. Caleb recognized some faces in the crowd. Agnes was there, looking fierce and standing straight. Tom Garrett gave him a single slow nod. Dr. Foster was there with her medical bag, holding it like it was a weapon. The preacher and his wife were there too. Mary Henderson was standing near the back, her face a perfect mask of guilt. And then, over on the left side of the courtroom, was Harriet Crane, dressed in a black dress with a severe bonnet, her face arranged to look like she was the wounded one. Next to her sat Cornelius Webb, a skinny man with sharp features and a suit that cost too much. Behind them stood George Peaton, who looked like he would rather be just about anywhere else in the world. Blackwood met them right at the door. "Morrison is the judge today. He is a fair man, but old-fashioned. He puts a lot of stock in blood relations. We have got to be perfect in there today." "We will be," Ellie said, her voice steady. Blackwood looked down at her, and something changed in his expression. Maybe it was respect. "Yes," he said. "I believe you will." They found their seats. The judge came in. He was an older fellow with iron-gray hair, and the look of a man who had heard every sad story this territory had to tell, and was expecting to hear one more. Webb started first, his voice smooth and polished. He painted a picture of Harriet as a woman overcome with grief, who had made a desperate choice because she was poor and was now just trying to bring her family back together. He called her up to the stand, and she put on a beautiful show. She cried right on cue. Her voice trembled when she talked about how much she loved her nieces, and she gave a carefully practiced story about how she had given them food and directions, and never ever meant for the children to get hurt. Blackwood's questioning cut right through it. "Mrs. Crane, you testified that you gave the children supplies. What exactly did you give them?" "Bread, water, and directions." "How much bread?" "Half of a loaf." "And the water?" "1 jar." "1 jar of water for 2 children about to travel 60 miles in the middle of December?" Blackwood let his words just hang there in the air. "Did you give them shoes?" "She had shoes on." "Your niece showed up at Mr. Weston's ranch barefoot, Mrs. Crane. She had frostbite on both of her feet. She must have lost them somewhere on the road. Did you provide her with a coat?" "I gave her a shawl. A cotton shawl. In a Montana blizzard." "I gave them what I had." "You gave them what was convenient." Blackwood pulled a piece of paper from his file. "I have a letter here from the Douglas Mission. They do not have any record of expecting these children. No warning they were coming. No plans made. Did you get in touch with them before you sent a 10-year-old girl on a 60-mile journey?" "I just figured they'd take in anyone who needs help. You took it on faith, but you never checked." Blackwood let the silence hang for a moment. "Mrs. Crane, is it not a fact that you told those children to leave because your intended Mr. Peaton was hesitant to marry a woman with dependents?" Harriet's calm finally shattered. "That is not so." George adores children. Mr. Peaton informed you, and this is a direct quote from your niece's sworn statement, that he would not marry a woman burdened with another man's orphans. 2 days after he said that, you sent those children packing. Is that correct? She is telling falsehoods. That girl has always been a fibber. Is she now? Because Mr. Piton is seated right over there and he has lost all the color in his face, which makes me think your niece is telling the plain truth. Every eye in that courtroom swung to Piton, who had the look of a man seeing his good name go up in smoke. Mrs. Crane, Blackwood said in a low voice, you did not get rid of those children because you were poor. You got rid of them because they got in your way, because the man you wanted saw them as extra baggage, and you chose him over 2 little girls your own dying sister put in your trust. Objection. Webb shot up from his chair. The counselor is making speeches. Sustained. Mr. Blackwood, stick to the questions. I have no more questions, Your Honor. Harriet walked back to her seat, her face a stone mask and her hands trembling. Webb murmured something to her, but she brushed him away. Blackwood began to call his witnesses. Dr. Foster presented the medical findings. It was precise, crushing, and could not be argued. Tom Garrett vouched for Caleb's good name and the amazing turnaround of the ranch. Agnes Whitfield declared to the court that she had known Caleb Weston for 15 years and Ruth Weston for 12, and that those little girls were cherished and looked after, and anybody who failed to see that was a plain fool. Then Daniel came to the stand. He was on edge, his knuckles white as he gripped the chair, but his words came out strong. I rode away from this ranch 3 years ago because I held my father responsible for my mother's passing, he stated. I was mistaken to put that on him, but I was in mourning, and sorrow can make a man cruel. I returned because he sent for me, because he wrote about 2 children who were in need of a place to live. And the moment I stepped into that kitchen and saw what he had made, what they had all made as a family, I was certain my mother would have been filled with pride. She would have swung that door open wider than any of us. She would have put up a bigger fight. But my father is doing it. He is doing the very thing she would have done, and that counts for something. Next, Blackwood had Ellie come forward. She moved to the stand on legs that shook but did not fail her. She was put under oath. She settled into the oversized chair, placed her hands in her lap, and met the judge's gaze. Miss Morgan, Blackwood began softly, can you please tell the court what took place at your aunt's home? Ellie recounted it all. The endless cooking, the scrubbing, the frigid barn where she huddled with a feverish baby, while Harriet entertained her gentleman caller, the smacks across the face for a late supper. The afternoon Harriet gave her a crust of bread and told her to get walking. She spoke of the 3 doors that were never opened, of the snow that erased the road until she could no longer find her way, of Josie growing quiet. She told the story plainly, without theatrics or a single tear, just the hard facts. And in a strange way, the lack of tears was more powerful than any emotional display might have been. Here was a child who had endured so much that speaking of it no longer caused her pain. She had moved beyond the hurt to a quiet, numb place inside. And when you got to Mr. Weston's ranch, Blackwood prompted. I did not get there, Ellie corrected him. I fell. He discovered me in the snow, face down. I cannot recall much of what happened next. I can recall his voice. He said, she is alive, talking about Josie. And right then I knew things would turn out all right. Because for the first time someone actually cared if she was living or dead. Are you content at the Weston Ranch? It is the only place that has ever truly felt like home. Do you wish to remain there? More than anything else in this entire world. For what reason? Ellie's eyes went from Caleb to the judge. Because he stepped out into a blizzard. He had no idea what he would find out there. It could have been a pack of wolves. It could have been absolutely nothing. But he still came. At every other door I knocked on, the people inside decided we were not worth the bother. Her voice grew firmer. He decided we were worth it. And that is the only thing that has ever really mattered to me, that someone believed we were worth opening a door for. Webb's attempt to question her did not last long. He hinted that Ellie had been told what to say. She put a stop to that with the calm certainty of a person who has been misjudged her entire life. "Nobody instructed me on what to say," she declared. "Nobody needed to. The truth is not so difficult to understand." Judge Morrison then asked for the final arguments. Blackwood's was short and to the point, leaving no doubt. Webb was smooth with his words, but his argument had fallen apart, and every person in that room was aware of it. The judge sat in silence for a good long while. Then he took off his glasses and began to speak. "I have listened to a lot of testimony in this court today, and a good deal of it was difficult to hear. It is true that the law favors blood relations, and there are solid reasons for that principle. However, the law also has a duty to protect children, and when those two duties are in conflict, the well-being of the children has to come first." He turned his gaze to Harriet. "Mrs. Crane, you have let these children down in a way that this court finds very disturbing." He then looked at Caleb. "Mr. Weston, you have shown a level of care and dedication that goes far beyond what is normally required." Finally, he looked at Ellie. "And you, young woman, have displayed more bravery and truthfulness in this courtroom than many grown-ups show in their whole lives." He placed his glasses back on. "This court is awarding temporary custody of Ellie Morgan and Josie Morgan to Mr. Caleb Weston for a term of 6 months. Mrs. Crane will be allowed 1 supervised visit per month. When this time is over, the court will meet again to make a final decision on their home. And at that time, the stated wishes of the older child will carry considerable influence." The gavel came down. Ellie looked at Caleb, and her whole face seemed to break wide open. It was not crying, but something much larger. It was the look of a person finally setting down a heavy load they had carried for so long, they had forgotten how it felt to be free of it. 6 months, she breathed. 6 months, and then you get to choose. My own choice, all yours. She wrapped her arms around his neck and just clung to him. And Caleb held her just as tight while Josie wiggled in and grabbed a handful of each of their shirts, pulling herself into the embrace. Daniel stood just behind them, a hand on Caleb's shoulder, as the courtroom filled with a low murmur of approval from people who knew they had just seen the beginning of something broken being healed. Harriet strode out of the room without looking back, Peyton trailing after her like a sorry excuse for a shadow. Out on the courthouse steps, Agnes gave Ellie a hug so fierce it lifted the girl's boots right off the wooden planks. Dr. Foster took Caleb's hand in both of hers and shook it warmly. Tom Garrett remarked it was about damn time something turned out right in this part of the country. And Daniel, just standing a little ways off with his hands in his pockets, met Caleb's gaze and gave a single firm nod. That one nod said everything. The journey home felt different than the one coming in. It was lighter. The quiet between them was no longer filled with tension. It was the easy silence of folks who have weathered a storm side by side and made it through. When they got back to the ranch, Ellie hopped down from the wagon and just stood in the yard, staring at the house as if for the very first time. 6 months, she said again. Then it will be for good. You really believe that? I know it. She gave a little nod. Then she took Josie from Caleb's arms and headed for the front door. She paused on the porch and looked back. Caleb? Yeah. I am going to cook supper tonight, a proper celebration meal. I would like that very much. And Caleb? Yeah, thank you for opening your door. Then she was gone inside. Caleb remained in the yard with his son standing next to him as the winter sun finally pushed through the clouds for the first time in what felt like weeks. You did a good thing, Pa, Daniel said softly. Caleb turned to face him. His son had not called him Pa in 3 long years. We all did, he answered. They went into the house together. It smelled of baking bread and fresh coffee. And something else Caleb did not quite recognize, but felt deep in his bones. It was the smell of what was to come, a thing still delicate and unknown, but worth every single fight. The first court-ordered visit happened on a Wednesday toward the end of March. The woman sent to supervise was named Mrs. Helen Pratt. She was a small woman with sharp eyes who clutched a clipboard like a shield and spoke with the clipped precision of someone who had witnessed too many bitter custody disputes to hope for a good outcome. Harriet showed up in a plain gray dress with a lace collar, her hair done softly, and an expression carefully crafted to imitate kindness. George Peaton was not with her. "Hello, Ellie," Harriet said, stepping onto the porch. Her voice was as sweet as honey, but it could not hide the bitterness beneath. "You are looking well. And little Josie, my goodness, look how big she is getting." Ellie just stood there in the doorway, holding Josie on her hip, not saying a word. "May I please come inside?" Harriet asked, her eyes flicking toward Mrs. Pratt. "That is for Ellie to decide," Caleb said from behind them, standing behind the screen door. Ellie just stepped to the side without saying a thing. Harriet came into the house and her eyes darted everywhere. The clean floors, the warm stove, the picture of Ruth on the mantel. She took stock of it all with the quick, sharp eyes of a woman searching for something to use as a weapon. They sat down in the front room. Harriet took the armchair while Ellie sat on the sofa with Josie. Caleb stood near the doorway and Mrs. Pratt sat in the corner with her clipboard. "Tell me about your school," Harriet started. "Are you going?" "Yes, ma'am. I started back in January." "And how are you liking it?" "I like it just fine. My teacher says I am ahead of everyone in reading and writing, but behind in my numbers. But I am catching up fast." "That is nice." Harriet smoothed out her skirt. "I always believed education was very important. I tried my best to teach you at home, but you were just so against it." "You never taught me a single thing. Mama taught me how to read before she passed on." Harriet's smile got a little tighter. "Well, either way, I am glad you are learning." She leaned forward in her chair. "Ellie, I want you to understand that I have changed. George and we have talked a lot about what happened. We both know that mistakes were made." "Mistakes?" Ellie's voice was completely flat. "You call sending us out into a blizzard a mistake?" "A terrible one. One that I regret more than anything." "Do you regret the part where Josie nearly died, or just the part where you got caught?" Mrs. Pratt's pen started moving across her clipboard. Harriet's calm expression flickered for just a second. "I deserve that," Harriet said, choosing her words with care. "I know that I have lost your trust, but I am asking you for a chance to earn it back." "Why would I do that?" "Because you are my family." "We were not family when you sent us out walking into a storm. We were not family when you picked Mr. Peaton over a sick little baby. We were not family when you told me you would have me arrested if I ever came back." Ellie's voice never got any louder. It just stayed low and steady, which was a whole lot worse than if she had been shouting. "You do not get to use that word only when it suits you, and then toss it aside when it does not." Harriet's hands clenched into fists in her lap. For just a heartbeat, something real and honest moved behind her eyes. It might have been shame. "I was scared," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was all alone and poor, and I was terrified of being alone for the rest of my life. That is no excuse for what I did, but it is the honest-to-God truth." Ellie just looked at her aunt for a long, long time. Josie started to fuss and reached for a wooden block on the floor. Ellie set her down and watched her crawl over to it. "I believe you were scared," Ellie said at last. "But I was scared too. Every single day I was in your house, I was scared. I was scared of saying the wrong thing. I was scared of Josie crying too loud. I was scared of the slap that would come if supper was late. I was 9 years old, and I was scared all the time. And you were the one who was making me feel that way." The room fell completely silent. Mrs. Pratt kept writing. Harriet just stared down at her hands. "I do not hate you, Aunt Harriet," Ellie said. "I used to. On that walk, I hated you more than I have ever hated anyone in my life. But hating someone takes up a lot of energy, and I needed every bit of my energy for Josie. So I just stopped hating you, and I started feeling sorry for you instead. I feel sorry for you because you lost us, and we are pretty great." Ellie picked Josie up, and the baby let out a laugh, grabbing a big handful of her sister's hair. "Josie says Mama now." She claps her hands whenever the chickens come running for their feed. She took 4 whole steps last week before she tumbled over. You missed all of that, and you are going to keep on missing it. That is your loss to live with, not ours." Harriet's eyes started to glisten. These were real tears this time, not the kind she put on for the show in the courtroom. "You sound just like your mother," she whispered. "Good. My mama was worth sounding like." The visit was over about 20 minutes later. Harriet left without even asking if she could hug the girls. At the gate she paused and looked back one last time at the house. The way she was standing sort of sagged, like a rope that had been pulled too tight for too long and had finally gone slack. Mrs. Pratt finished up her notes and pulled Caleb to the side. "That little girl does not need a supervisor watching over her. She needs a podium to speak from." She tucked the clipboard under her arm. "My report is going to say exactly what I saw here today. A calm, well-spoken child expressing some very real complaints. An aunt who showed a few moments of actual feeling, but does not have it in her to accept what she did wrong." "What does that mean for the final hearing?" "It means you are in a mighty strong position." "But Mr. Weston," she looked him straight in the eye, "do not get too comfortable. 6 months is a long time. People have a way of changing their tactics." And she was right about that. Harriet changed hers. The second time she came to visit, she brought gifts, a doll for Josie and a new hair ribbon for Ellie. She seemed softer now, more careful. She asked questions instead of just making declarations. She said nice things about the house, complimented Ellie's cooking, and pointed out how healthy Josie looked. Ellie took the gifts with polite thanks and placed them on a shelf. After Harriet was gone, she never touched them again. On the third visit, Harriet took a different approach. She came by herself. No Peyton, no putting on a show. She sat down right across from Ellie and said, "I broke off my engagement to George." Ellie looked up from what she was doing. "Why?" "Because you were right. I picked him over you, and that was wrong. I cannot take back what I did, but I can show you that I have changed." "Changed in what way?" "I have taken in a boarder, a widow who has a young son. I am helping take care of him. I am proving that I can be a responsible person. Proving it to who? To us or to the judge?" Harriet flinched. "To both of you." "Well, at least you are being honest about it." For her fourth visit, Harriet brought the widow's son. He was a little boy about 6 years old named Teddy, who stayed hidden behind Harriet's skirts and just watched Josie with big, curious eyes. Ellie let him hold one of the chickens. The boy giggled, and Harriet watched them with an expression on her face that Caleb could not quite decipher. After that visit, Ellie was quiet for a very long time. She just sat on the porch with Josie and did not say a word until the sun had almost disappeared. "She is trying," Ellie said at last. "Yes, she is. Does that change anything?" "Ellie, does it change anything for you?" Ellie thought about it for a while. She thought hard, with the kind of seriousness you see in someone who learned way too young that words carry a heavy weight. "No," she said. "Her trying now does not erase what happened before. It just means she is finally doing the things she should have been doing all along." "That sounds fair. Do you think it will be enough for the judge?" "I honestly do not know. But it is your voice that is going to matter most in that courtroom, Ellie. The judge himself said so." "My voice." She said the words like she was holding them, testing to see if they were strong enough to bear the burden being put on them. "Caleb, what if my voice says one thing, but the law says something else? Then we will just have to fight the law." "You cannot fight the law. You just watch me." She almost cracked a smile. Spring was slow to arrive in Montana that year. It kind of crept in around the edges of winter, like it was not quite sure it was welcome. The snow melted away in patches, showing the brown grass and mud underneath. And then the first stubborn little shoots of green began to appear. The ranch started to shake off its quiet winter slumber. Caleb bought some new cattle. Tom Garrett came on to work full-time. Agnes started bringing her goat over a couple of times a week, and Josie would toddle after it, squealing with pure joy. Ellie started the spring term at the schoolhouse. Miss Catherine Greer, the teacher, sent a note home with her after the first week. It said, "Ellie is an exceptional child. She has a quick mind, a kind heart, and is a natural leader for the younger students. She broke up a fight between two boys twice her size just by telling them they were embarrassing themselves. They both apologized." Caleb showed the note to Ellie. She read it 3 times over. She said, "I am exceptional," Ellie whispered. "You surely are. Nobody has ever said that about me before." Then nobody was paying close enough attention. Daniel ended up staying through all of March and on into April. He worked the ranch right alongside Caleb, and the long silences between them started to feel less angry and more comfortable. They did not talk about Ruth, not straight on anyway. But sometimes in the evenings, Daniel would pick up the photograph of his mother and just hold it for a minute before he set it back down. And Caleb would see the muscle in his son's jaw tighten and know that the grief was still there, but the anger was gone from it. It was just sadness now. And sadness was something a man could learn to live with. One night, Daniel and Ellie were sitting out on the porch together while Caleb was putting Josie to bed. When he came back downstairs, he could hear them talking. "Your pa is a good man," Daniel was saying. "I know he was not always, or maybe he always was, but he just forgot how for a while. After Ma passed, he just quit. He quit caring, quit trying, he quit everything. I truly thought he was going to drink himself into an early grave. What was it that changed?" "You did." Daniel's voice was low and quiet. "You and that little sister of yours. You gave him something to care about again. You gave him something to fight for. He gave us the very same thing. Yeah, I reckon that is how it works sometimes. People just saving each other. Your mama would be real proud of him, of both of you. You really think so?" "I know so. He talks about her like she hung the moon and the stars. A man who can love a woman that hard does not just stop loving. He just needs someone to come along and remind him that it is all worth it." Daniel was quiet for a good long while after that. Then he said, "You are way too smart for being 11. I will be 12 in June. Still too smart. I will work on being dumber." Please do not stop, Caleb thought. He leaned his back against the hallway wall, just letting the sound of his son and daughter laughing together wash right over him. Because that is what she was, his daughter. Not by blood, and not yet by law, but in every single way that counted. In every way that Ruth would have known and given her blessing to. The final hearing was scheduled for September 15th. It was in Judge Morrison's courtroom. The same room, the same judge's bench, the same dusty beams of light shining through those high windows. But everything else felt different this time. Caleb was wearing a brand new suit. Ellie had on a dress she picked out all by herself, a green cotton one with white trim, because green had been her mama's favorite color. Josie wore a tiny little outfit that she had already gotten breakfast all over. Daniel sat right there behind them, clean-shaven for the first time in I do not know how long. Harriet was there too, in the very same seat, but she looked different now, a little smaller somehow. It was like the sharp edges on her had been worn down by 6 months of trying and failing, and trying all over again. Webb was sitting next to her, but even he seemed to understand that the ending to this story was already written. Blackwood was calm and collected. He had spent the last 6 months putting together a case that was tighter than a drum. Mrs. Pratt's reports were powerful in their simple, honest truth. Dr. Foster's new medical records described 2 healthy, growing children. Miss Greer had written a letter about Ellie's school progress that made her cry just writing it. Agnes and Tom and the pastor and what felt like half the town had sent in letters about Caleb's character. The hearing was a whole lot shorter than the first one. Both sides laid out their arguments. Harriet got up to testify again, but this time it was not a performance. She just spoke plainly about what she had done and her reasons why, and about how she had tried to make a change. It was the most honest anyone had ever seen her be in that courtroom. Ellie just watched her aunt with a look on her face that was not angry, and it was not forgiving. It was just clear. When it was Ellie's turn to speak, the judge asked her the one question that this whole thing had been leading up to. "Miss Morgan, you are 12 years old now. You have been living with Mr. Weston for 9 months. You have had regular visits with your aunt. You have had plenty of time to think about what you truly want. So I am asking you straight out, and I want you to give me an honest answer. Where do you want to live?" Ellie stood up tall. She did not look over at Harriet. She did not look back at Caleb. She looked that judge right in the eye. "With Caleb Weston, Your Honor." "Can you tell me why?" "Because he came outside for us in a blizzard when he did not have to. Because he picked me up off the ground when I could not even stand. Because he fed my sister when she was about to die. And he never once asked for a single thing in return." Her voice was steady, and it carried to every corner of that silent room. "Because when I told him we would not be any trouble, he told me, 'Stop saying that.' Because he bought me a new pair of boots and did not say a word about what they cost. Because he sits with me when I get scared and does not tell me to stop being scared. He just stays right there until the fear goes away." She took a breath. The whole courtroom was holding its own. "My aunt says that blood is what makes a family. And maybe she is right. But blood did not come outside during that storm. Blood did not warm my sister and bring her back to life. Blood did not fight for us in court, or write letters to lawyers, or teach me how to read the sky to know the weather." Ellie's voice firmed up into something that could not be shaken. "Caleb Weston did all of that. Not because the law said he had to, not because blood made him do it, but because he chose to. And now I am choosing him right back." Not a soul moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Judge Morrison took off his glasses. He cleaned them slow-like, put them back on, and looked out at everyone with an expression that was no longer just a judge's, but something deeply human. "In 23 years sitting on this bench," he said, "I have rarely heard someone speak so clearly to the heart of the matter before me." He folded his hands together. "This court finds that the best interests of Ellie Morgan and Josie Morgan are without a doubt served by placing them permanently with Caleb Weston. Full legal guardianship is hereby granted with all the rights and responsibilities that go with it. Mrs. Crane's claim for custody is terminated. If Mr. Weston decides to pursue a formal adoption, this court will welcome that petition." The gavel came down. Ellie turned around and looked straight at Caleb, and her face did something he knew he would remember for the rest of his days. It just broke wide open, not with sadness, not with relief, but with the kind of pure joy that only people who have seen the absolute worst and survived it can feel when they are finally told they are allowed to stay home. She ran right to him and threw herself into his arms. He caught her and held on tight, and Josie let out a happy squeal from Daniel's lap. Then the courtroom filled with the low, happy rumble of folks who had just witnessed something good and right happen in a world that so often gets things wrong. "We won," Ellie said, her voice muffled against his chest. "We really did win." "Yeah, kid, we sure did. I am not going anywhere." "No, you are not. Not ever again." Daniel brought Josie over, and the four of them just stood there in a tangle of arms and tears and laughter as the courtroom slowly emptied out around them. Agnes was crying. Tom Garrett was blowing his nose. Dr. Foster was shaking Blackwood's hand with both of hers. Harriet just sat by herself on her side of the room. She did not move for a long while. Then she finally stood up, smoothed out her dress, and walked over to the aisle. She stopped right beside Ellie. "You meant every word you said," Harriet said in a quiet voice. "Every single word." Harriet nodded. Her eyes were red, but they were dry. "Your mama would be so proud of you, Ellie. She would be proud of the woman you are becoming. I know she would. For whatever it is worth, I am sorry. Not for the judge or for the court, but for you. I am sorry that I failed you." Ellie looked at her aunt for a long, long time. Then she said, "I hope Mr. Piton makes you happy. I ended things with George months ago. I know. I hope you find someone who does not ask you to choose." Something in Harriet's face seemed to break. She pressed her lips together tight, gave one single nod, and then walked out of that courtroom without ever looking back. Outside, the September sun felt warm on all their faces. A crowd had gathered there on the courthouse steps. Agnes hugged Ellie so hard the girl let out a squeak. Miss Greer was wiping away tears. Mary Henderson stood off at the edge of the crowd, and when Caleb met her gaze, she mouthed the words, "I am sorry." He just nodded. It was enough. It would have to be. Daniel caught up with them at the wagon. "I am heading back tomorrow, I figure, but I will be back for Christmas, and maybe—" He stopped and swallowed hard. "Maybe I will stay on through the winter, help out with the ranch, get to know my sisters." He said that word like he was trying it on for size, like a boot that did not quite fit just yet, but maybe it would with a little time. "We would like that," Ellie said. "Wouldn't we, Caleb? More than anything in the world." Daniel stuck out his hand. Caleb took it. Then Daniel pulled him into a hug. It was rough and clumsy and over way too fast, but it was real. It was the first time they had hugged in 3 years. "Ma would be proud," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Of all of us," Caleb said. The ride home was a noisy one. Ellie talked and talked about the look on the judge's face, about Blackwood's final speech, about the little smile Mrs. Pratt gave when the gavel fell, about what she was going to make for supper, and what she would write in her journal, and how she just could not wait to tell the chickens. "The chickens do not care about court rulings," Caleb said with a smile. "The chickens care about everything. They are very emotionally intelligent. They are birds, emotionally intelligent birds." Josie babbled right along, throwing in her own little bits of commentary that nobody could understand. Daniel rode his horse alongside the wagon, and every once in a while Caleb would catch him smiling at something Ellie said. When they finally got to the ranch, the gate was standing wide open. The house was just waiting. A little curl of smoke was rising from the chimney where Agnes had kept a fire going for them while they were gone. Ellie climbed down from the wagon and just stood there in the yard with Josie on her hip, looking at the house. "What is it?" Caleb asked her. "I just want to remember this. Exactly how it looks right this minute. The smoke and the light in the windows and the sound of the chickens." Her voice was soft, because this was the moment that it all became real. This was the moment it stopped feeling like it could all be taken away. It was never temporary, Ellie. Not from the very first night. She looked at him and she smiled. It was not the careful, guarded little half-smile she had been giving him since the day she first showed up. This was a full smile, open and trusting and so bright it could light up a room. "I know," she said. "I think I always knew." They all went inside. Agnes had left supper warming on the stove. There was a note on the table that read, "Congratulations. Now stop your worrying and eat something. The chickens are fed." Ellie laughed and set the table for 4. Then she stopped and just looked at the 4 places. Felt too big or sometimes too small. "It's a family table," she would say. "It's Caleb." "Yeah. Can I call you Pa?" His throat got tight. He had to turn and look out the window for a second, out at the land Ruth had cherished, at the sky she had watched every single evening from this exact spot. "Yeah," he finally said. "I would be honored." "Pa," she said right away, just testing the sound of it. Then she said it again, a little stronger. "Pa." She gave a big grin. "That feels right. It sounds right, too." That night, after they had dinner and washed the dishes, and after a long talk with Josie about bedtime, Caleb sat by himself on the porch. The stars were shining bright. The air had that first little chill of autumn in it. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called, and another one answered. He heard the screen door creak open. Ellie padded out in her nightgown and Ruth's wool socks, and came to sit right next to him. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I do not want to. I want to stay in today just a little bit longer." They sat there in a comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that only happens between people who do not need words to feel like they are not alone. "Pa, yeah. Thank you for opening the door. You have already thanked me about 100 times. I will probably say it 1,000 more. I reckon I can live with that." Ellie leaned her head against his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her. Josie was sound asleep upstairs in the room that had been Ruth's sewing room, which was now, finally, a little girl's room. Daniel was in his old bedroom, the same one he had stormed out of 3 years ago, angry, and had now returned to with a gentle spirit. Pa. Yeah, I am going to write our story down. All of it. The walk and the storm, and all the doors that closed, and the one that opened. That way Josie will know when she is older. She will know exactly how we got to be here. That is a good idea. And maybe someday other kids will read it. Kids like me, who think nobody is coming for them. So they will know to keep on knocking, because sooner or later one opens. Because eventually one always opens. The stars wheeled across the sky above them. The coyotes grew quiet. The house stood warm and solid at their backs, full of sleeping children, and the smell of fresh bread, and the spirit of a woman who would have absolutely loved every minute of this. Caleb looked at Ruth's photograph through the window. The glass caught the starlight, and for just a heartbeat, he could have sworn she was looking right back at him, smiling, telling him what she had always told him. That the measure of a man was not what he did when things were easy, but what he did when things got hard. He had done the hard thing. He had opened the door. Months later, on a morning so bright with the first snow of the new winter, Caleb filed the adoption papers. Judge Morrison signed them without any fuss. Ellie Morgan became Ellie Weston. Josie Morgan became Josie Weston. And there in the courthouse book, in black ink on cream paper, a family was made official that had been real since the night a man heard a scratching at his gate and chose to walk out into the storm. Ellie hung a sign above her bed that she had painted all by herself. 4 words in careful letters. This is my home. And above the front door, where every visitor could see it, Caleb hung one of his own. This door is always open, because it was, and it always would be. It was for strays, and for strangers, and for children with nowhere else left to go. For anyone brave enough to knock, and for anyone desperate enough to try just one more time. The door was open, the fire was lit, and the family inside had been built not by blood, but by a choice made in a blizzard, by a man who had forgotten how to live until a barefoot girl reminded him why. That was the only ending worth having. It was not perfect, and it was not easy, but it was real, and real was everything.